Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to be unpacking the story of Agamemnon. Now, you probably know him as the great king of Mycenae and the formidable, iron-fisted commander of the Greek forces at Troy. But if you think you know his whole story, you might actually only know half of it. Because depending on which ancient tale you read, the shape of his legacy changes completely. His legendary image is famously, and pretty drastically, split right down the middle. So we're going to explore how one man's image fractured into two completely different legends.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because the contrast here is absolutely jarring. In Homer's Odyssey, Agamemnon's own shade speaks from the underworld, and he describes his deceptive welcome on the threshold and the blade that ended him. I mean, think about that. How does a powerful conqueror, a man who literally steered armies and entire nations, become a bitter, betrayed ghost issuing warnings from the underworld? Well, to understand this mystery, we have to first look at the original version of his legend.
Section 1. The commander at Troy. A very proud leader.
In Homer's Iliad, we get this grand, sweeping look at a truly powerful leader, where Agamemnon's legacy is defined by immense power, grand military strategy, and what we might call the brutal arithmetic of war. He isn't just a passive participant in history, he is actively out there making it. He's not just some one-dimensional tyrant either. He's a complex figure of command and conflict, and his legacy in this story is measured purely in ships, sieges, and battlefield glory. It is a world where the tragic costs of pride are paid in a war that just absolutely consumes heroic lives.
But being the top commander comes with immense burdens. Agamemnon enforced what we call the honor economy of archaic Greece. He claimed the absolute authority to redistribute prizes and punish any slights against him, expecting total obedience from his men. But the stubborn pride, it leads directly to disaster. The Iliad actually opens with this famous quarrel with Achilles over honor and the captive woman Briseis. By taking Briseis for himself, Agamemnon damages army morale so badly that he risks catastrophic, devastating losses on the battlefield. It really shows us a leader whose decisions, and frankly, his personal flaws, steer the fate of entire nations.
And this brings us to a brilliantly dark illustration of the grim choices of wartime leadership. Some versions of his backstory emphasize a truly chilling ritual, the sacrifice of his very own daughter, Iphigenia, just to secure favorable winds for the Greek fleet. Now, even if this is framed as strict obedience to divine will or just harsh wartime necessity, it's a deeply cruel decision that marks Agamemnon with a permanent moral stain. For sure, he is forever known as the commander who traded his own child for a military advantage.
So, the absolutely crucial point we're left with in the Troy narrative is this. What does leadership actually cost? The Iliad uses Agamemnon to intensely interrogate heroic ethics in wartime. What happens when honor leads to bitter division? What are the true burdens of a sovereign who has to make impossible choices?
But then, the genre shifts, and we're forced to ask a much darker, much more intimate question. What does war cost your home? This is where the story hard pivots from the bloody battlefield to the deeply vulnerable domestic sphere that follows the conflict.
Section 2. The tragic return home and the sting of domestic betrayal.
We can actually map this rapid fall from grace pretty clearly. He goes from being the untouchable commander of the Greek forces to a man stepping over his own threshold, receiving a totally deceptive welcome, and ultimately meeting the blade that ends him. This is the domestic politics of power at play. He returns to a household where political and personal loyalties have violently shifted, all orchestrated by his plotting wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus.
And that brings us right back to that powerful scene in Book 11 of the Odyssey. Odysseus actually meets Agamemnon's shade in the underworld. Stripped of his army, his wealth, and his life, Agamemnon's voice is just bitter and resigned. He recounts his murder and warns Odysseus about the extreme, hidden dangers of returning home. It's a chilling reminder of how fast power slips away when you leave the public stage behind. The threat isn't an enemy army anymore. It's the intimate treacheries born of vengeance and lust.
Now, what's really interesting about this next part is the stark contrast. Section 3. Contrasting the two Agamemnons, two completely diverging legends. First up, we have the Agamemnon of Troy on the left, the active sovereign. He is public, he's military, he's procedural, and he is actively out there making history. But contrast that with the post-war Agamemnon on the right, the passive, betrayed figure. He is domestic, entirely helpless against his own household, and transformed into a literal object lesson. It perfectly highlights the stark juxtaposition between commanding valor abroad and absolute vulnerability at home.
Kings, it turns out, are definitely not immune to domestic politics. When we look at how the audience and the genre shape a character, it's just fascinating. Different genres use the exact same man to ask vastly different cultural questions. I mean, look at this. In the Iliad, his personality is proud and authoritative. His legacy is tied strictly to military success, and the core themes revolve around heroic ethics and the gods. But jump over to the Odyssey and tragedy, and he's bitter and vulnerable. His legacy sparks retribution in these endless cycles of blood, driving themes of betrayal, gender, and law. Epic poetry weaves him into a heroic tapestry. Tragic drama uses his personal fall to expose the fragile social orders that follow a war.
Section 4. The birth of civic law and how justice evolves. So Agamemnon's story isn't just about a really bad homecoming. It actually reflects a massive cultural shift in how ancient Greece thought about justice. This evolution happens in 3 distinct steps. First, we have hubris and war. Agamemnon's actions, like taking Cassandra as a captive and that earlier sacrifice of Iphigenia, give Clytemnestra, who becomes a highly complex avenger here, the moral justification for his murder. Second, this murder sparks a private vengeance blood feud, which eventually leads to matricidal vengeance by his own children. Basically, murder just invites more murder. But third, and honestly most importantly, this endless spiral of violence forces society to evolve. It births a legal order. His death essentially becomes a civic problem that demands a public resolution. In Aeschylus's famous Oresteia, this resolution is the establishment of the Areopagus. It's a public court established by the goddess Athena to move the community away from private, bloody revenge and toward a system of public trial. It's like a giant reset button for society. It shows that only legal institutions and decisive moral reckonings can halt the spiral of vendettas.
So, to synthesize all of this, remember, these aren't just 2 conflicting stories about one single king. They represent one man spanning 2 entirely different eras of Greek thought. Together, these 2 faces make Agamemnon one of Greek myth's most morally complicated figures. His life and his death allowed later writers to deeply explore the transition from personal vendetta to civic law, and from wartime glory to domestic tragedy.
I want to leave you with this final, pretty provocative thought. It's so easy to just look at Agamemnon as ancient history, right? But the core issue here is incredibly relevant today. When modern heroes return from war, how fragile are the social orders they come home to? That precarious transition from conflict to peace is a very human story, one that outlasts Mycenae, outlasts Troy, and outlasts antiquity itself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the legends.